She thought barging into my lake cabin would give her the upper hand. After all, in her mind, the HOA rules made her untouchable. But the second she crossed that threshold, her smug confidence vanished. The look on her face froze in an instant because the person sitting across from me wasn't just a guest. It was someone who could end her reign of petty power in one blow. What she saw that day didn't just shatter her control. It exposed everything she'd been hiding. So the question is, how far will someone like her go when their empire starts to crumble? The lake had always been my refuge. Tucked deep in the woods, far from the constant hum of city life, the cabin was where I went when I needed to breathe again. The air carried the sharp scent of pine, and mornings were greeted with the shimmering surface of the water catching the first touch of sunlight. To me, it wasn't just a piece of property. It was a promise of peace, of privacy, of escape. But peace rarely survives long when power-hungry neighbors circle like hawks. The cabin sat in a private lakeside community, one that had slowly fallen under the iron grip of its homeowners association. On paper, the HOA existed to maintain property values and preserve community standards. In reality, it had become a tool for control, an endless stream of fines, warnings, and restrictions that seemed designed less to protect the neighborhood and more to feed the egos of those in charge. And no ego loomed larger than hers. She wasn't the elected president of the HOA. She didn't even technically hold a position on the board. But she had something even more powerful: fear. Residents whispered her name in frustration, in anger, sometimes in genuine dread. She was relentless, inserting herself into disputes, reporting the smallest infractions, and dictating how others should live. Around the neighborhood, she had earned a nickname that clung to her like a badge of dishonor. H.O. a Karen. At first, she didn't bother me. I had kept a low profile, only visiting the cabin on weekends or holidays, slipping in and out unnoticed. But when I started spending more time there restoring the old dock, trimming back overgrowth, repainting the siding, I caught her attention. It didn't take long before I received my first notice from the HOA, a warning about the color of my garage door. A second followed, this time about unauthorized construction. When I replaced a rotting section of deck railing. It was petty, irritating, but manageable. Or so I thought. Neighbors weren't so lucky. Some faced fines for leaving kayaks on the beach too long. Others were written up for hosting family barbecues that disrupted the peace. One couple had their application to build a small guest shed denied because it didn't fit community aesthetics, even though 3 other houses already had nearly identical structures. Every story carried the same theme: arbitrary enforcement, selective targeting, and one woman at the center of it all. And the more I heard, the clearer it became she thrived on intimidation. Watched her confront an elderly man for parking his pickup too close to the curb. She stood in his driveway, finger wagging, voice raised, while he shuffled awkwardly, trying to apologize for something that had no real impact on anyone. I saw her corner a young mother over a children's swing set, claiming it violated visual harmony. The woman nearly cried, and the swing disappeared within the week. Little by little, she was tightening her grip on the community, bending people to her will not with fairness or leadership, but with pressure, shame, and the constant threat of fines. Still, I kept to myself. I wasn't looking for a fight. My time at the cabin was supposed to be restorative, not another battlefield. But power doesn't stop where it feels resistance. It pushes harder. Her gaze turned toward me more frequently. I noticed her car idling near my driveway. I'd catch her walking the perimeter of my property, phone in hand, snapping photos. Notices from the HOA began piling up, each one more aggressive than the last. Supposed violations that twisted the rules beyond recognition. Accusations that bordered on absurdity. And with each letter, it became harder to ignore the truth. I had become her next project. But here's the thing she didn't know. I wasn't the kind of person who backed down. The lake cabin might have been a sanctuary, but I wasn't naive. I understood how people like her operated, using fear as currency, assuming others would fold under the weight of embarrassment or financial strain. And maybe most people did. Maybe that's why she'd gotten away with it for so long. But what she didn't realize was that my patience had a limit. And she was about to cross a dot. For now, though, I stayed quiet. I let her think she was winning, that her intimidation was working. Meanwhile, I prepared. I gathered every notice, documented every absurd claim, and kept detailed records of her interference. Because the only thing more dangerous than someone drunk on power is someone who believes their power can't be challenged. And when she stormed into my cabin that day, ready to strike her latest blow, she didn't know that she was stepping into the very trap she had built for herself. The notices came faster than the leaves falling from the trees that autumn. One after another, thick envelopes with the HOA's letterhead stuffed into my mailbox, each one laced with the same patronizing tone. Violation. Garage door paint inconsistent with community standards. Violation. Unapproved dock repair. Violation. Excessive noise after 8 p.m. The last one nearly made me laugh. Excessive noise? I had been sitting alone on the porch that evening, sipping coffee and reading, the only sound coming from crickets along the shoreline. But when I looked at the fine print, I saw the same signature at the bottom, Karen Patterson, HOA Compliance Liaison. That title wasn't even official. She had made it up. It became clear this wasn't about rules or standards. It was about control, and more specifically, it was about controlling me. Neighbors started to whisper warnings. "She's had her eye on you," one said in hushed tones at the community boat ramp. Another told me about the time Karen filed a noise complaint against them during a family birthday party, claiming laughter carried too loudly across the water. Each story was another thread in the web she'd spun, a net designed to catch anyone who dared push back. And then came the fines. Small at first, $50 here, $75 there. Enough to annoy, not enough to justify a lawyer. But soon, they ballooned. One notice claimed my dock repairs were unauthorized structural modifications that required a $500 penalty. Another slapped me with $1,000 for unregistered watercraft. That boat, by the way, had been registered and approved years ago, long before I even bought the cabin. The more absurd the claims grew, the more obvious it became that she wasn't trying to enforce rules. She was trying to break me down. Karen had underestimated one thing. I wasn't easy prey. Instead of crumbling, I doubled down. I logged every violation notice into a binder, cataloging dates, photos, and copies of community bylaws. I spoke to neighbors, quietly gathering their stories and collecting evidence of her selective enforcement. Some were hesitant, afraid of retaliation, but others were eager to talk once they realized someone was finally willing to stand up. Meanwhile, Karen escalated. She began showing up unannounced. I'd catch her at the edge of my driveway, phone out, snapping pictures of my truck, my mailbox, even my firewood stack. Once I spotted her crouched near the dock, pretending to inspect erosion damage while filming me through the camera on her tablet. Then came the intimidation. One evening, I returned from town to find a bright orange violation sticker slapped onto my garage door, accusing me of hazardous storage. Inside the garage, neatly stacked paint cans, sealed and stored on shelving. There was nothing hazardous about it. The sticker wasn't about safety. It was a scarlet letter, a message to the entire neighborhood. You're next if you don't obey. The tension spread like smoke through the community. People began avoiding eye contact, ducking away rather than risk being seen talking to me. Karen had perfected her strategy: create enough fear that resistance seems impossible. But fear has a limit. One evening, I got a knock on the cabin door. It was Richard, an older neighbor who'd lived on the lake for nearly 30 years. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. "She's gone too far," he whispered, sliding a thick folder across my kitchen table. Inside were copies of his own violation letters, dating back years: fines for having a satellite dish, for planting shrubs too close to the walkway, even for flying the American flag on a pole that was, according to Karen, a visual obstruction. "That flag was for my son," he said quietly. "He died overseas, and she fined me for it." His voice cracked, and in that moment, my determination hardened into something stronger than annoyance. This wasn't just about me. It was about everyone she had bullied, everyone she had silenced. Still, Karen wasn't slowing down. At the next HOA meeting, she pushed a new agenda item: a motion to revoke my lake access privileges until I paid outstanding fines. The room was silent as she presented her case, projecting photos of my supposed violations onto the screen. Out-of-context shots of my deck repairs, grainy images of my boat dock, even pictures of guests who had visited me, labeled as unauthorized gatherings. For a moment, it looked like her plan was working. Board members shifted uncomfortably, murmuring among themselves. That was her strategy: overwhelm with paperwork, bury people in accusations until no one had the energy to argue. But when she finished her tirade, I stood and calmly laid my binder on the table. Page by page, I dismantled her claims. I pointed out contradictions in her reports. I cited the actual bylaws she had twisted. I showed photographs time-stamped and clear of the conditions she had exaggerated. By the time I was finished, the room had turned. Neighbors exchanged glances, some even nodding in agreement. For the first time, Karen looked rattled. She stormed out of the meeting, muttering threats about further consequences. And that's when the real war began. Within a week, I received a letter claiming I was in violation of community security protocols. Apparently, she had reported me for harboring unauthorized guests. The guest? My sister, who had visited for the weekend. Another fine followed, accusing me of endangering wildlife because I left a porch light on overnight. Each claim more ludicrous than the last. Each one another shot fired in her campaign of harassment. But by then, I wasn't just defending myself. I was preparing for something bigger. Behind the scenes, I had been in contact with state officials. HOA boards might act like mini-governments, but they're bound by laws. 2 laws about harassment, misuse of authority, and fraud. And Karen's paper trail was full of it. What she didn't know was that I wasn't the only one keeping records. Other neighbors had begun slipping evidence into my mailbox. Screenshots of threatening emails, copies of inflated fines, even audio recordings of her berating residents in public. The stack grew thicker every week, a dam ready to burst. Still, she pressed harder. One night, I heard a car pull into my driveway. The crunch of tires on gravel was unmistakable. When I looked out the window, there she was, flashlight in hand, snapping pictures of my cabin under the cover of darkness. I stepped onto the porch, and the beam of her light froze on me. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face, but she didn't retreat. She doubled down, yelling that she had every right to inspect community properties. That was the moment I realized something vital. Karen wasn't just drunk on power. She was convinced she was untouchable, and that conviction was about to destroy her, because the next time she stormed into my cabin, she wouldn't just be facing me. She'd be walking straight into a meeting she never expected, one that would strip away her power, her reputation, and the illusion of control she had built. The day it happened, The sky was heavy with storm clouds, pressing low over the lake as if nature itself knew a reckoning was coming. I had been expecting her for days. Her behavior had grown more erratic, her notices more desperate. She couldn't accept that her control was slipping, that the community she had ruled through fear was beginning to see her for what she was. And sure enough, just past noon, her car came barreling down the gravel road, tires spitting dust as she screeched to a stop in front of my cabin. The slam of her door echoed through the still air, followed by the sharp staccato of her heels striking the porch. She didn't bother to knock. She never did. She stormed in like she owned the place. But this time, she froze, because she wasn't walking into a quiet cabin with just me waiting inside. Sitting at my table were two people she never expected to see, a state investigator and an attorney, representing a group of residents she had wronged. The thick binder of evidence I had spent weeks compiling sat open between them, page after page of her fabricated violations, inflated fines, and targeted harassment laid bare under the unforgiving light of the afternoon sun. For a moment, the room was silent. Her eyes darted from me to the documents, then to the unfamiliar faces studying her with calm, unflinching intensity. Her confidence wavered, but only for a heartbeat. Then she drew herself up, lips tightening into that familiar mask of superiority. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, voice sharp, brittle with false authority. "You can't just," the investigator interrupted, his voice steady, practiced. "We're here to review a series of formal complaints filed against you, Ms. Patterson. Your conduct as a self-proclaimed HOA representative has raised serious concerns." Her face paled, but she tried to recover. "Complaints? This is harassment. These people are violating community standards, and I'm the only one willing to enforce them." But her words rang hollow in the presence of hard evidence. The attorney calmly slid a document across the table, an official letter outlining legal action already in motion, class action, multiple plaintiffs, allegations of fraud, defamation, harassment, and misuse of HOA resources. Every page was another nail in the coffin of her power. I watched as the realization dawned on her, the cracks spreading across her carefully constructed armor. For years, she had wielded intimidation like a weapon, certain no one would ever challenge her. And now, faced with a mountain of proof and professionals who couldn't be bullied, she was cornered. Still, she tried to fight. She lashed out, her voice rising, accusing me of conspiring against her, accusing neighbors of lying, accusing the board of cowardice. She even threatened to find the investigator himself, her words unraveling into absurdity as desperation consumed her. But the more she ranted, the more she revealed. Her arrogance twisted into rage, her confidence into panic. Until she wasn't a feared enforcer anymore, she was a spectacle. Neighbors began gathering outside, drawn by the commotion. I saw faces at the windows, cautious at first, then emboldened as her tirade echoed through the open cabin door. People who had once shrunk under her glare now watched her unravel, whispers passing through the crowd. And with every word, she dug herself deeper, exposing her tyranny to the very people she had ruled through fear. The investigator let her finish, his expression unreadable. Then, in the silence that followed her outburst, he calmly closed the binder. "Miss Patterson," he said, "you are no longer in a position to intimidate anyone. From this moment forward, your actions will be subject to legal review. I suggest you consider your words carefully." The weight of that statement hit her harder than any fine she had ever issued. For the first time, she had no power, no leverage, no audience forced to obey. Just accountability. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes darting once more around the room. She must have seen the truth in our faces, the inevitability of what was coming. Without another word, she turned on her heel and fled the cabin, the slam of the door echoing like the final gavel strike of a judge, but the damage was done. Her empire had collapsed in front of witnesses. The whispers outside grew into open conversations, neighbors comparing stories, sharing details they had once been too afraid to admit. What had started as one person's fight had become a community, uniting against a bully, and for the first time in years, people didn't look at her with fear. They looked at her with defiance. That was the turning point. The day the tide shifted. The day the lake community stopped being her kingdom and became ours again. In the days after she stormed out of my cabin, the atmosphere around the lake shifted. It was subtle at first, like the faint breeze before a storm clears the air, but you could feel it. For years, the community had lived under a weight of constant pressure, every interaction tinged with fear of what she might do next. Now that fear was dissolving, neighbors who once kept their heads down began speaking more openly. At the mailbox, at the boat ramp, in driveways, they compared notes, realizing their stories weren't isolated incidents. Each of them had been targeted, manipulated, or shamed in some way. And now, with her mask torn away in front of witnesses, there was no denying the truth. She had never been protecting the community. She had been controlling it. The investigator wasted no time. Within a week, formal notices were sent to the HOA board demanding compliance with state regulations and a review of every violation issued under Karen's so-called compliance role. The attorney representing the residents filed suit, citing years of harassment, misrepresentation, and financial misconduct. What she had thought of as harmless intimidation, slipping fines into mailboxes, confronting people in their yards, was now being scrutinized under the harsh light of the law. The board, once complicit through silence, scrambled to distance themselves. At the next meeting, held in the community center, the turnout was larger than anyone had seen in years. Chairs filled quickly, people lined the walls, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the air until the gavel struck. When her name appeared on the agenda, the room fell silent. Karen sat stiffly near the front, her once commanding presence diminished by the sheer weight of the crowd around her. For years, people had avoided her gaze. Now they stared openly, their patience spent. One by one, residents stood and spoke. Richard told his story of the flag he had been forced to remove, his voice steady despite the tremor of old grief. A young mother described how her children's laughter had been silenced when their swing set was dismantled. Others recounted fines that had nearly bankrupted them, repairs delayed for months, gatherings shut down under the pretense of community harmony. Each testimony was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of abuse that no one could ignore. By the time the floor closed, the board had no choice. A motion was made to permanently bar her from any official or unofficial involvement in HOA governance. It passed with unanimous approval, the applause that followed carrying the release of years of pent-up frustration. But the story didn't end there. The legal proceedings stretched on for months, but slowly, piece by piece, the truth came out. Records revealed that she had fabricated violations, exaggerated reports, and in some cases, pocketed money from fines that had never made it into the HOA's official accounts. The attorney's case grew stronger with each discovery. Faced with mounting evidence, her options dwindled. Eventually, a settlement was reached. Restitution to the residents she had wronged, repayment of misappropriated funds, and most damaging of all, a permanent injunction barring her from holding any position of authority in any HOA in the state. For someone who had built her identity on control, it was the ultimate humiliation. Life at the lake began to change. Without her constant interference, the community started to breathe again. Families gathered on the beach without fear of being reported. Laughter carried across the water long into summer nights. Neighbors who had once kept their distance grew. closer, united not just by proximity, but by the shared experience of surviving her reign. The cabin, once shadowed by her presence, felt lighter too. I could walk the property without scanning for her car, work on the dock without worrying about a fine showing up in the mail. More than that, though, I saw the strength of a community that had rediscovered its voice. Richard raised his flag again, proudly this time, and no one dared question him. The young mother rebuilt the swing set, her children's laughter returning like a song that had been missing too long. And each time I saw these small victories, I was reminded that standing up to her hadn't just been about me. It had been about giving everyone the freedom to live without fear. As for Karen, she disappeared from the neighborhood soon after the settlement. Her house went up for sale, and whispers spread that she had moved in with a relative in another town. No one missed her. The control she had clung to so desperately had evaporated, leaving behind only the memory of what unchecked power can do when good people stay silent. In the end, her downfall wasn't just about a single confrontation in a cabin. It was about truth catching up to arrogance, about a community realizing that fear only works when it's shared in silence, and about one woman learning, far too late, that power built on intimidation crumbles the moment it's exposed. Now, when I sit on the porch and watch the sun set across the water, I think about how close we all came to losing what mattered most. Not just peace, but dignity. Not just quiet evenings, but the right to live without someone else's shadow looming overhead. And I wonder how many other neighborhoods are still living under the thumb of their own version of Karen? How many people are still too afraid to speak, waiting for someone else to take the first step? Because the truth is, it only takes one person willing to stand up, one person willing to pull back the curtain, for an entire community to find its courage. And once that courage takes root, no amount of intimidation can stop it. That's the real story of the lake cabin. Not the violations, not the fines, not even the courtroom battles. It's the reminder that power belongs to the people who refuse to be silenced. And when those people finally rise together, no Karen in the world can stand against them.